Okay, so let's bring up our PowerPoint. Also, make sure you put your name in the chat so I make sure I get your attendance right. And someday I will actually update that. Hey gang, it looks like my Zoom has frozen, so I'm gonna go off and come back on really quick. So hang in there for just a second. You right? All right, let's hope this works now. Okay, I'm gonna hit share again. We'll let's try this one for today. Mhm. Okay, so where I believe we left off last time is that we were talking about let me look clarifying, and in that sub kind of idea we were talking about, this is where you purposely kind of want to interrupt a client's train of thought because maybe they've gone off track, maybe they are starting to not make sense. Maybe you're picking up that they're trying to avoid the topic in the first place. So you've stopped the client and kind of just ask for clarifying questions. So what we were going to start with this class is what kind of questions should we be asking? And it shouldn't be surprising to anyone in the class that the things that we want to avoid are closed ended questions. For example, are you feeling sad today? Um, and what we want to aim for is open-ended questions, questions that will actually elicit a less than a yes or no response. Okay. Um, so probably a good example of this is if you ever ask someone, how is your day going? Right? They usually elicit with fine, it's good. How are you feeling? I'm fine, I'm good. It usually is a 1 or 2 word response that you get out of them. What we want to do when we think purposely about questioning is what kind of question, how should I ask a question that will prompt a person to give more than just I'm fine, yes or no, sometimes, those types of answers. So it allows a client to speak more about the issues as opposed to responding to the closed question with a yes or no. Always check in with yourself before asking a question, and this is important to ensure that the reason you're asking is in the client's service and not, for example, to satisfy your own curiosity. It's a good idea to avoid why questions, which can sound judgmental to the client's action and decisions. I kind of wanted to read that because there is something in our field that we call social voyeurism among professionals. And social voyeurism is when a professional, hey, class, hold on just a moment. I will be right back. I'm sorry about that. I needed to check in with someone really quick. So what I was explaining is this idea of social voyeurism in our professional field. And this is when an individual, a professional, starts going down a line of questioning to satisfy their own curiosity, their own wanting to know about what happened to a person. Okay. This most often happens in the trauma field. Okay. I mentioned a time and time again in this class that in order to help a person, it doesn't really help to go relive that event. Okay. Now, we had an example last week where there's this group activity that was explained where they go into their past and they realize good memories and bad memories, and it had to do with historical trauma. There are activities like that that do help along the healing process. But even with an activity like that, we always try to bring it back and focus on how that makes the individual feel here and now that they've expressed those emotions and those feelings. And whether it's given them some type of relief or has brought more issues on. Okay. A lot of times, therapists and group facilitators, instead of getting in the line of being the therapist, they actually start to think that they're the investigator and that they need to know what exactly happened so that a timeline can be established and all of those kinds of things. And I want to say this is not our job. Unless you are doing an investigation for child services or adult protective services, our job is not to investigate. Our job is to heal. And that doesn't require us to know exactly what happened in a timeline. Okay. And there has been many times, and I've had to answer this question too to my supervisors, where I've come out of a session room in a group room, whether it be group or individual, and they asked, "Why did you ask these questions?" And in my mind, when I was doing the session, it made sense. But then after being questioned about it afterwards, there was really no therapeutic reason for me to have asked the questions that I asked. And I've seen this with people I've supervised and the like. So it's really important before you ask a question to do a self-check and ask yourself, what is the therapeutic value of of us knowing this bit of information? Is it going to help the client heal? If in our mind we think it does, but there is no reason, then it's time to stop that line of questioning. Okay. And so questions become very in, become very important in the therapeutic process, because what we want to do is allow the client to understand their own stories with our questioning. It's not for us, it's for them. So when we're doing things like clarifying for understanding, it's not for us to establish something that is missing. It's about helping the client understand their story. And sometimes it's about kind of trying to keep them on track and bring them back from those safe stories that they tend to tell and try to get them into that difficult place where they need to heal and they need to work on and they need to face and overcome. Okay. So this is the use of questions. So kind of the steps in this, I don't know if there's another slide on this. The steps in this is that one, your clients are talking, and you need to just get them on track. One, you ask the question in your head and say, does this have a therapeutic value? And will this help my client, not help me? Then the second part is asking yourself, how can I ask this question so it's just not a yes or no? Okay. And so think about that, and we'll have some examples when we go into the relapse prevention example and the trauma group example, because it's really kind of a difficult to give good examples right at this moment. Just remember, we're heading towards open-ended questions, and what we're going to try and avoid is through our questioning, satisfying our own need to know something. Okay. So the last sub-skill is summarizing, okay? And this is really, really important for group sessions, okay? In individual sessions, usually you kind of do a review and say, next time we'll be talking about this, and this is what I want you to work on this week. But in a group setting, you really want to purposely think about how you're going to summarize the end of the session. Okay. So we have, again, the main skill that we have is the rephrasing skill, right? Where a client tells us something, we tell it back to them. We're holding that mirror against them so that they can hear and feel the words that they're saying. Summarizing is a sub-skill of that. It's taking the entire session and putting it in a paraphrase form, okay? So I'm just going to read these real quick. This skill is used towards the end of the session, and is effectively a longer paraphrasing session. It's a useful way for counselors to reflect on the key points of the session before bringing it to a respectful close. Try to keep these summaries brief. They shouldn't be more than just 3-4 minutes, but meaningful and true reflection of the material the clients has brought to session. Summarizing can also be used to start a second or subsequent section, showing that you recall the previous session and reminding the clients of previous work. It's important, however, not to make clients feel that they must continue the same thread, unless perhaps working on an active directive modality, okay, such as cognitive behavioral therapy or a manualized therapy. Okay, so summarizing is basically when you, as the group facilitator, kind of get up, or you say, okay, let's review what we've talked about in this session. Okay, and you bring up important points, poignant points that certain individuals in the group may have made during that session. Sometimes it might have been a session that only 1 or 2 or 3 of the group members made really poignant statements. I have had some groups where all 9 of the group members said something, so I kind of put them all together. I kind of combined them and came up with themes of what was stated in that group. Then you talk about what you worked on in that group. What skills did we go over? What conversations did we have? And then you do a quick review of homework, saying during this week, we're going to work on our thinking journals, for example. And every time you have a trigger, I want you to write in your thinking journal and reflect on it using the place, time, situation, and thoughts and feelings format, something like that. And then give a motivational statement about coming back the following week. Hey guys, we've had a really good group this week. We were all engaged. Let's keep that motivation going. And I look forward to seeing you next week. And so, again, this has some important components to it. One, it shows that you were there during the group completely. There wasn't a time where you just kind of fluttered off and was in your la la land, and that you were listening and you were engaged. Okay. Two, it allows the group members to kind of realize what they just went through in a short perspective. Three, it reminds them of the skill that they've developed and the skills that they're going to start to develop and work on over the next week. And then four, it encourages them and motivates them to come back to the next session. Okay. So summarizing is a skill I would encourage you to do. What I used to do is during breaks and stuff, I would make little notes about different things people would state and whatnot. So I had that. So when I summarized, I will admit, when I summarize, I usually had my little notebook that I wrote in during breaks and during brief intermissions when people were doing a group activity or something like that. And I would read off that and say, hey, this is what we've done. And that's okay because it shows them that you are engaged, you have things down, and you're looking forward to that next group, and you're keeping track in a sense. Okay. All right, immediacy. Describe immediacy. It was first described in 93. It described immediacy as the key skill of focusing attention on the here and now relationship of the counselor and client with helpful timing in order to challenge defensiveness and heighten awareness. Using immediacy means therapists reveal how they themselves are feeling in response to the client. Okay, immediacy, the buzzword that is used right now is this term called mindfulness. Mindfulness is this practice of not letting your mind wander into the future or to the past and being present in the moment. Okay. So the most basic mindfulness practice on an individual level is you sit and either you focus on your breath or you focus on your thoughts and your feelings here and now. And when your brain starts to drift to the past or to some negative event that you just went through or something like that, you bring yourself back to right here. Likewise, if your mind starts to drift to, what I'm going to do when I get home, or what I'm going to do when I go somewhere else, or what am I doing this weekend, it's stopping yourself and again bringing yourself back to right here, right now, what you're feeling, what you're thinking right here in the moment. That is the basics of mindfulness. And then there's all kinds of practices behind it. Immediacy is kind of mindfulness in the group setting. Okay. It's when things are getting so intense, so emotional, and so almost to that point where it's going to go out of control, that you stop and you say, okay, real quick, because we need to just come back to right here and now. What I want you to all do is I want you to all breathe, hold, breathe in, hold, breathe out. Now we're going to do this to the count of 5 times. Okay. And at the last breath, this is where the therapist says, right here and right now, when we were going through this, this is how I felt. I felt like you weren't communicating with me, that you were closing up, or you were becoming frustrated with the situation. Okay. It's really kind of a de-escalation strategy. But what it does, especially substance use and for trauma, is it takes that person out of that trauma mindset and brings them back into this safe moment. But it also allows the client to hear right then, right here, right now, this is how I felt when you were saying X, Y, and Z. Okay. And we'll have again, this last part of class, we'll have some examples of where counselors have had to use immediacy to bring back the focus to we're here, we're in this group. In a way, what you're doing with the client is you're saying you're not in that environment right now. You're right here, you're right now. And your response is what's making the situation similar to the one that you've experienced. Okay. And so it's this moment of mindfulness in the group setting instead of the individual setting. Okay. So the last part of this is what we hope is that all of these skills that we've developed to this point in the group, from emotional intelligence to therapeutic process to client-centered approach to these skills that I want you to work on, that conflict, while it will be a natural process of the group process, conflict that can grow into, for example, physical aggression, yelling, verbal abuse, those kinds of things will be minimized. Okay. With that being said, if you're especially going to work with very difficult populations, such as offenders, specifically, I'm thinking, especially, for example, domestic violence offender groups, those kinds of things, substance use groups where the participants are ordered to be there. In a lot of these situations, conflict is going to be a part of the group process. So we want to spend a last few minutes of this conversation that we're having on facilitation skills on conflict resolution. Okay. And then again, these last few, again, when we go over the relapse prevention and the trauma group examples, we'll see where conflict resolution can kind of come in, because it can also be a learning process for our clients. Because what we hope is that we will model these conflict resolution skills so that the clients can start using it for themselves. Okay. So what is conflict resolution? And it's a way for two or more parties to find a peaceful solution to some type of disagreement. Okay. Why should we resolve conflict, especially in the group setting, to come to an agreement that benefits all parties? To understand more about whose ideas, beliefs, and backgrounds may be different from your own. A lot of conflict you will find in the group setting comes from people who may be there for the same reason, but they have two different experiences that brought them there. And one may feel that their experience trumps another person's experience. Okay, no pun intended. To ensure that your relationship opponent continues to grow. So we want us to see our differences, come to a common resolution so that we can continue to develop peacefully. And that is, in the end, we want to find a peaceful solution to a difficult situation. Now, okay. So I do want to just say in this section here, in a couple weeks, we will talk about what's called de-escalation. Okay. What we're talking about here with conflict resolution is something that just happens right after de-escalation. De-escalation is when you bring down the emotional tone of the room, you bring down the emotion of anger, the emotion of fear first, and then you enter into this conflict resolution. Now, the reason why we're not putting this right here is because all of those other skills that you guys have learned are what you'll use for de-escalation. In fact, this use of immediacy, this one right here, is a de-escalation type of technique. Okay. The other sub tool that we looked at, let's see, where is it? Clarifying is another form of de-escalation. Okay. What we'll talk about a little bit later in the course is when people start to take their emotions and they start to physically act out on them. Okay. That they're starting to get up in their chair, they're puffing up their chest, they're getting ready for that fight mode. How do we get them from there into a rational mode? Okay. So just wanted to bring that up. Oh, okay. So these are the basic steps to conflict resolution. One is understand the conflict, okay? And this is now these steps are mainly for you. You're going to be what we call this impartial mediator. You're also going to be the person who tries to understand all of these type different factors, okay? So understanding the conflict is understanding both sides. This is using your listening skills and your paraphrasing skills in making sure that the both individuals both feel heard and understood. Okay. Then the next job is to communicate with the opposition. So usually if we look at it in simple terms, let's say Joe and Bill are in a conflict. Maybe well, we won't think of a situation right now, but they're really starting to argue. They're upset with each other, and so you take again in this conflict resolution. The first step is to one separate them. Okay. If you've ever seen or been involved in or understood things like traffic accidents, domestic violence calls, the first thing police officers do when they come to a crime scene, if you want to think about this in this kind of way, is they take the two primary people that are in the accident, and officer one goes with one, officer two goes with the other. When they come onto the domestic violence scene, they find the two people who are in the conflict. Officer one takes him in, if we're think of it as a male-female relationship, takes him, and another officer takes her, and they separate the two, and each officer listens to their stories. And then in this case, the officers come together and they collaborate with each other, and they do more of an investigation to see if stories are consistent, those kinds of things. That's not what we're trying to do, but it's an example of what you do in this situation. And then usually what the officers do when they come to a decision is then they go and communicate with both sides and says, okay, we're going to arrest this person. We'd encourage you to do this and the like. In the therapeutic setting, what we want to do is one, we want to break the group, say, let's take a 15-minute break. You tell Joe and Bill, Joe, Bill, you stay here. You take Joe, you talk to Joe, and then you come back in and say, Joe, hold on here, and go talk to Bill. And you do that listening, reflecting skill that we talked about, that clarifying skill that we talked about. And you come back together and you say, okay, this is what you go to Joe and you say, this is what Bill is saying, this is what, and you do that again, you do some clarification, okay? Then, once you feel that there's some common ground that you can work with, then you bring Joe and Bill together and you go into the brainstorming uh, component, okay? In the brainstorming component, I forgot to put the caps on. In the brainstorming component, what we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, now that you both know each other's stories and you told them to me and I've relayed them to both of you, what are some solutions we can come to? Okay. Now I will say that the majority of time, this is where conflict resolution ends. Because usually, because both of them have been felt like they've been heard, and from an impartial person, they understand where each other is coming from now. Then they come up with a resolution. Usually this is where conflict resolution ends. Okay. But if it doesn't, then we go on to the next stage, which is use of an impartial mediator. Now, this is where you as the therapist needs to decide if you can be impartial or if you need to bring in another group member. Okay. Now, what I mean by that is if at any time you were part of that conflict, that through the discussion and everything, you kind of were part of facilitation of that conflict. You cannot be an impartial person at that moment. You can't do that. So then you bring in another group member and say, hey, sometimes if it's serious, like there's been threats or something like that, you may bring in another facilitator or a supervisor or another therapist. Okay. A lot of times, though, we can do this with another group member or you. But let's say you weren't a part of the beginning of the conflict, you were there, you witnessed it. And so you then are going to say, okay, this is the deal. We're going to hear both of you guys out, and we have to have an agreement that whatever decision is made will agree upon. Any decision that I come up with that mediates between the two of you, that this is going to be the resolution of the conflict. Okay. And then you go through, so you did resolutions, now you have to explore alternatives. So since we couldn't find some common ground here, what can we do here with exploring alternatives to decide what we can do? Because we couldn't find a resolution, so we got to find an alternative, okay? In this, you need to use those skills of mindfulness. It's not the word mindfulness, but that other word I used, and whatnot, to make sure that you're bringing them into the moment, into the present, so that you reduce the stress and you don't engage in pressure tactics. Again, you're there listening, you're there reflecting, you're there doing all of those things. You're not pressuring them to decide, okay? And then you, as the impartial mediator, say, okay, we've came here, we've seen some alternatives. You both have been listened to and everything like this. So this is going to be the resolution. This is how we're going to move forward, okay? And you provide that decision and you say, okay, this is the decision you agreed that you both would agree to the final decision. Are we okay with this? And then you move on. Okay. Now, this looks pretty. I will tell you, it does get a lot more messy than this. And a lot of times conflict is much more vague than these simple logical steps to a solution. So I don't want you to think that this is a step 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, and eventually you're going to end up in this kumbaya moment. In a lot of conflict resolution, there's always going to be someone who feels a little bit angst. And sometimes there'll be another person who feels like all of their wants were fulfilled. There's going to be times where someone's just going to decide, I'm done with this group, I'm not coming back. And so I don't want you to think that this is a perfect model, but it's the best that we have right now. Okay. And so again, watching the examples, we will go through a conflict resolution thing. We'll watch a video with a therapist engaged in conflict resolution. So you'll see these things worked out as we move forward. Okay. All right. I'm going to exit, I think. Start. All right, I'm going to stop sharing. I said we only had about 6 slides left, and a lot of these last ones are really ones that we'll see examples of as we move forward. So I am going to stop our YouTube, and we'll actually get out of here a little bit early. Whoops, let me stop our YouTube if I can. Come on.